Now, in the West, because of the weight of historical guilt that is upon us, a variant of the sense of original sin in a very real sense, and because of a very real attempt by those possessed by what might be described as unhelpful ideas to weaponize that guilt, our young people face a demoralization that is perhaps unparalleled. This is particularly true of young men, although anything that devastates young men will eventually do the same to young women. And that, in this era of anti-natalism and equally reprehensible nihilism, is precisely the point.
Very quick audio. God, it has to be quick. It's one of those post-liftoff, I find just the right terms, post-liftoff. And so this is just as a quick summary of why we'll never get anywhere, even if we had been called out and asked to come on these debates with the likes of Jordan Peterson. I would put Jonathan Haidt in here as well. These people associate the negative contents of beliefs with self-destructive ways of being. So if your belief is merely negative or more critical of any particular end of life than they would want you to be, if it's more critical than they think is necessary, they will associate that with negativity, psychologically speaking, and they will associate it with just these self-destructive ways of being. You have to think a certain kind of positive way for them in order to simply avoid self-destructive ways of being. They would never come right out and put it in this clear a term, but it just radiates from them, from so many of the implications of what they believe. And the disdainful way, the last time I watched a Jordan Peterson clip, the disdainful way in passing in which he referred to anti-natalism. You know, this thing that's just sweeping up Western culture, according to his standards. Even though he's had debates with careful anti-natalists such as David Benatar, there's just these two Petersons, man. If he thinks that just that many more people are listening, because they are when he's on Shapiro's program, he will just simplify. He knows that there's nothing about the sort of Benatarian approach to the asymmetry. He knows that there's nothing sinister about that. It should be followed by a word like nihilism. But he says things like in that screed, it was an anti-trans screed. You don't have to buy into any of the trans agenda in order to realize that he just pivots in these ways and he wants to sweep a bunch of things into one. Because he genuinely associates the negative contents of thought and of even well-formed belief. This can be a well-formed belief, but for him, if it's negative in its contents, it's psychologically negative and it's going to bring you into a lower, more miserable state of being. This is what they believe, but they would never come right out and say it. But it just follows from so many of the implications, like saying anti-natalism is sweeping up Western culture. And then following up with a word like nihilism, which he of course never uses in any of its technical applications. He just uses it to mean a kind of defeatism. That's these, nihilism bad on arrival. We've decided what we want, and we're just going to use a word like nihilism to relay the very opposite. So this is a kind of unwinnable dance. Nihilism as the immediately pejorative thing, where there's technical, non-colloquial forms of nihilism that should be debated on its merits, as opposed to some kind of what's against our prefixed motive. But he just used nihilism right after he used anti-natalism. I'll try to retrace my steps and find that clip. Anyway, this was just supposed to be a very quick post-liftoff audio, because I think this is a good way to put it. They associate the negative content of thought and belief with mere self-destructiveness. And it's almost like a natural law for them. But yeah, this will be a precursor, because this is a video I've been wanting to do for a long time. This will be a precursor to the video I do, where I actually tackle natural law views, because it's so implicit in so much of the culture. And they really do need to, these lifestyle advisors, they really do need to be made to struggle with the hard case. And I'm truly a hard case for them with these associations they really want to make to really rig the epistemic games, the various epistemic games, and the main one of the evaluative status of life per se. They so rig this against the negative on these subjective grounds. This care tactics the cultivating life arcs and stuff like that. And this is one way to not be able to see that life really should be viewed as an arc, and it's not about betterness and worseness. It's about just how much you can overcome. This is truly the rigging of the evaluative game. And this is what they engage in. And they've never truly had to confront the hard case, which is a character like myself who holds all these negative views, who thinks that the future will look back at us in horror simply because we're these urinators and defecators. If there's ever a post-urination, post-defecation society, excrement is just, it's barely even known. And then they look back at our time. You think we're mortified at the past when we get these glimpses into the past about what was the norm? People often talk about just, the lack of indoor plumbing, things of that sort. But, I mean, we're ways away if we think indoor plumbing gets us off the grotesque hook. We're not off the grotesque hook. So I don't even need to talk about malicious behavior here or ignorance. I'm just talking about things that truly, if we were in a post-defecation society, post a few other things like ticks. Ticks are just the most vicious of instincts. And I've known quite a lot of people who have these ticks. I have certain kind of ticks. I don't have as many as I did back in my childhood, but ticks we're not in a post-tick society. It's just people know when they're among others, they know how to hide their ticks. God, I probably underestimate the extent to which I have ticks and had ticks in the past when I really start thinking about these things. So it's about non-moral types of negative things here. I'm not impugning necessarily humanity as a group, which I wouldn't even do group analysis, but I'm not imputing humanity on moral grounds when I talk about the evaluatively bad status of life and the importance of the procreative asymmetry, right? It's just worse by orders of magnitude. It's much worse to bring into existence a person who you're given a 9th, 10th chance that they're going to go on to live the worst life of all time, compared by any standard. Whatever theory you want to build on top of what's a good and bad life, by any theory standard, it's a 9/10 possibility. And then the willingness to insert one such person into existence by birth or other methods, sci-fi methods, right? So it's the willingness to do that. That is order of magnitudes worse than the unwillingness to bring into existence a person who you have a 9/10 possibility, or let's just say 10 out of 10, it's a sure thing. The unwillingness to bring a person into existence who would have lived the greatest life ever, by all standards. And across all kinds of different evaluative domains. Greatest. This is a kind of greatest pluralism. And he wins by all theories, metrics. And the unwillingness to bring one such person into existence. Like, it is profoundly wronger to do the former than the latter, to the extent that the latter is at all wrong. I think it's arguably not even minimally wrong. The rain is starting to come down much harder, and there are people around, but I want to keep going because I actually like what I'm going over here. But that's a negative verdict, right? If there's ever been a major negative verdict, it's a negative verdict on a subject as huge as procreation. And it really shows who's biologically hooked and who's hooked by the will. It's a good test. It's to see the people who have the strongest negative reactions against anti-natalism, whether or not they actually understand it. I'm not even going to take that into account. The narrowness of it, truly. This doesn't mean that we have to be misanthropes, though I'm unapologetically a misanthrope who is non-hateful, broadly speaking, but still nonetheless a misanthrope. This ties into certain standards of disgust. If you're not grossed out by the fact that it's very likely you've overestimated the extent to which you don't have tics. It's very likely you've overestimated the extent to which you maintain your dignity every time you go to the bathroom, and this is not a big deal. This is a pretty big deal. Whether it's one or two, it's a big deal. It doesn't matter that you have the flusher, right? It exists. You should talk about it openly and not have that be associated with some sort of, teen angst. That's how they could just easily dismiss me on this if I had gone to their shows and argued with them, their podcasts. Or if I had just been allowed to be a kind of third wheel or a fourth wheel in a discussion. I don't care. Put me on a panel with a bunch of people. I'll bring something like that up. You know what would happen? They would just round it off to teen angst. Because it's so easy for them. Because it does get associated with a stage. You're just in a stage. It's like, I am far more negative now compared to when I was at my most irascible during my teens. I'm far more negative. I assign such more weight to my negative verdicts now than I did back then. You could even call me an optimist back then on certain things. So I don't apply for that. There's no way they could actually, if they actually had to listen to me at length, there's no way they could round me off to just, it's a stage thing. This person, right? It so works on people though. God, when I think about how when my friends turned 18, they just started exhibiting poise and these, I think, ultimately superficial indicators of adulthood, not like maturity, as in just striving for rationality, global rationality, let's call it, applied to the person. You maximize rationalism and you minimize the biological tugs that truly are there to manipulate you. And as I talked about in the last set of audios that should be uploaded by now if I get my editing act together, the last round of audios when I just said people are just these vessels of life, and the unwillingness to maximize your rational capacities above any other consideration, and how maybe by doing so you're minimizing other ways. If you can become a asocial, maximally rational agent, why wouldn't you? Sociality per se, that's ultimately what they want to preserve as well. If you just put a button in front of them, people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt, and we become these rational, truly maximally rational agents, but at the cost of becoming asocial. That is not antisocial, just asocial. We just don't have any of these social needs. We're self-contented. That's really my reading of asocial, is a person who is self-contented, doesn't need to reach outside. That I believe heightens our dignity, but neither Haidt nor Peterson would push any such button, because it's about sociality per se, just like it's about life per se, and rigging the game against critical views of these things. Rigging the game from the start by fixating on what's adaptive or maladaptive, right? But in many of these cases, certain things that might be considered negative in thought, the content of thought, certain things that might be considered maladaptive are just so because people don't like being in the minority. These are evolutionary reasons. Being an outcast throughout the 300,000 years of Homo sapiens, roughly speaking, but then we can take it beyond that. Being an outcast meant death. So people are maladaptive simply because the views they hold are unpopular, not because of the contents of the views they have themselves. A view like anti-natalism. Pardon the train. I had to get underneath the SkyTrain tracks because this train's coming down hard. But God, yeah, okay. So even if I had made it to these debates, I would be dismissed only if I couldn't have enough time to talk. If they just had to listen to me talk for long enough, they would realize that I'm a hard case for them, because I'm one of the most stable and reliable people that I know, and yet I've just mounted these negative views extended to so many different things, so many different evaluative domains. And just personally, I am less and less impressed with people as I age. They become more and more unremarkable. The locals with whom I have to interact, I don't have to hate them for that, but I am allowed to be profoundly disappointed. I'm entitled to that much. And if I come out here and say things like this, like I would just get lumped into that person who's like, oh, this is the recipe for self-destructive futures. Because they cite papers that show that, all these needy people who are socially needy, when they have their socially needy needs fulfilled, those people's lives go better. And so that's putting the cart before the horse. Truly rationalist maximization, if it hinges on becoming an asocial person, there's absolutely no justification. Insofar as we can just say that we're going to be agnostic on the status of whether it heightens or lowers our absolute state of happiness across our lives. We're just not going to know that. Happiness and whether we become more virtuous or more vicious, we're just going to control for all that. Here, we're just going to compare. Continuing to be the option of the status quo, continuing to be completely engulfed by sociality, its many needs. This really being linked to the idea that, the preservation of life qua life is the most important thing. This really does interact with sociality. And of course, a brief add-on has to be that, yes, I recognize that there's a difference, major difference, and it's a difference to which I will cede ground, but there's a difference between choosing to press the button for all and choosing to press the button for oneself. So let's just narrow it down to that prudential sense of whether or not you should press the button. It'll only make you more rational as you can possibly be. You're optimally rational if you press this button, but at the quote-unquote cost of being socially needless or socially need-free. You gain freedom from sociality, which is to me an added bonus, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an added bonus. It's just that's how my standards correspond to the facts on the ground right now. It's an added bonus. If I had a heightened view of the mass of the Vulk, then perhaps we could say it might be neutral, or it might be a true cost. But I imagine for most they would view it as a cost. But even if you view it as a cost, becoming socially needless, which I would term having freedom from sociality, we believe in many types of freedoms, specific personal types of freedoms. One should be striving to have freedom from sociality. So that's why it's an added bonus based on the standards that I have right now and how those standards correspond to the social facts on the ground. There's just, people are unremarkable. It brings me no joy to say it. So freedom from sociality would to me seem like an essential personal type of freedom. But okay, maybe I'm in the minority. I think most people haven't thought about it. And that's why I'm in the minority. People cannot think about it. From scratch, they build certain things in, and those things are pro-social on arrival. So for most people, it would be a cost, but even then, it should be a cost you're willing to take on because you gain so much with your optimally inflated rationality. You gain so much. You gain such a larger picture into reality. Access to a much larger picture and a much deeper dive into reality. And when people talk, especially these intellectually charged people who I think are pseudo-intellectuals, but these intellectually charged online people, man, they talk about the truth as if it is number one. That fundamentally characterizes their conviction in free speech absolutism. These people are very concerned with truth, but then I would pose to those people as well. Those are the intended recipients of this question above any other group. Ground your belief, your unconditional belief in free speech, precisely because you're so devoted to the pursuit of truth, which is admirable, but then you got to push that button. Whether or not you should push it for all, that's a separate question. I'll cede ground that there are important differences, but to the extent that you should push it for yourself, become socially needless, become maximally rational, what do you have to lose if you are indeed committed fundamentally to the truth above all else? You gain such a deeper dive into reality. Pardon the train. You gain such a deeper dive into reality. It would be a beautiful button. This would enhance the world not just morally and intellectually for you, but it would enhance the world aesthetically and in so many other ways. And it is that group beyond all others that I would be disappointed by if any of them within the group chose not to push the button in the name of sociality, preservation. And I think Peterson and Haidt are two offenders that I often just recall to mind habitually. So I think there's a reason for that, and I just covered it right now. And I'm going to flash various things on the screen that both of those chaps have written, or them mouthing certain platitudes that I will then type out and put next to them on the screen. All right, some traffic light time. I will resume this in an actual video probably at some point later, but most importantly, I hope this is still audible. Things are getting more ruckus, but I think I'm good. Most importantly, I want to point out that the title of this video, if I choose to title it this way, it's not directed at those who I'm scrutinizing. I'm sure it applies to them, but here I'm directing this at myself. These needs that I have to go after them specifically, and these debates that I'd like to have with them in terms of getting them to feel pretty humiliated during a live debate, because I can press their conviction about stuff like freedom of speech, I can press it up against their unwillingness to press one such button. I can list many other names, but the names that just keep coming back to me are the two guys that I keep referencing, but they're not equivalent. Peterson is much worse. Peterson is a truly hateful figure. His willingness to come out and simplify an issue as complex as anti-natalism and to use these two terms like ping pong, that's what he did in that video. He's a truly odious figure. And I despise him, and I want to admit that I despise him openly. I want to openly despise him. Train. And a long train, so I'm going to talk through it. God, why is this happening on a Sunday morning? Anyway, but I'm sure it's entertaining. But yeah, so if you can hear me, hopefully you'll still be able to hear me, but Peterson, I want to despise him openly. I don't want to despise him secretly, because I think he truly is that odious of a figure. There's very few people I'm willing to say this about, but for him to have come out and used anti-natalism and nihilism in this game of linguistic ping pong to impress the Shapiro listeners and his regulars, like, he knows he's concealing stuff there. He knows he's concealing stuff, but it doesn't matter to him, because at the end of the day, it's just brute fear that drives him. His excessive touchiness and protectiveness surrounding natalism, and even just in these ordinary cases of how he thinks procreation ultimately strengthens the bond between the parents, which is statistically dubious. But he says a lot of things that are just lovey-dovey in terms of procreation, and so he's just, you see him being so protective of it and touchy around it. It's not reason at the bottom of it. It's just brute fear. This man is driven by brute fear on so many of these important subjects that he's flippant about. So to hear him discuss my views confidently, I'd love to be in a debate, because he's hateful and I want to see him humiliated. And I believe even a halfway susceptible audience, they don't have to agree with me on everything, but even a halfway susceptible audience, if I can get him one-on-one and press him and squeeze him on what the unwillingness to push the button implies, it would be joy. It would bring me so much joy. As much joy as it would bring me for these other people that I'm going to go after. As natural law grovelers. God, yeah, that's going to be reserved for the video.
So one drawback to the audios, there's actually multiple drawbacks, but one that bit me in the ass pretty strongly is it just got way too windy and I was rendered unintelligible. The wind just drowned me out too much, and it was such a good part, so now I have to redo it, and I took bullet points. There were just a few things I said as qualifiers to the rant, midway into the rant, and as a separate audio, but here I'm just going to cover it now because you can't hear me in the audio only section. The other bad part about the audios is I just waste so much time looking for screenshots to cover the audio. I mean, I like it from an aesthetic standpoint, but it is a huge time sink. And then I also just, when I look for an image to include, I click on the link for that image, and then I just end up doing like research for the next video, because that image is loosely connected to the current video, but then it touches on into another issue. And so that as I'm supposed to be editing my video, I'm so curious about so many things, I can't even look at appropriate images to cover my video without then just reading the articles associated to those images. And it's just so hard. It's just even so hard to compile links for the videos, because then I finish reading one paper, I start reading an abstract of the next paper. It's just amazing that I never hear people who edit complain about these sorts of things. Like, people who edit, it's like really they're good at just being fixated on the fact that they've got this video, they've got to bang it out, and they do it. And these aren't even the people who have like a team. These are kind of powerhouses, YouTube powerhouses. It's clearly just the uploader. He's a one-man show, and yet he manages to get so much editing done without being distracted. Whereas like, I always end up distracted. I can start editing on Monday, and by Sunday I won't be done, because through the process of editing and trying to look for images and trying to look for the appropriate studies to back up what I said, I just end up reading and looking over a bunch of other stuff. And it's just, like, how is this not a common critique? Anyway, I deviated. There was an audio that was lost to the wind and other kinds of traffic noises, and it's just too much, so I want to just paraphrase what I said in that audio in kind of bulletproof form. A reasonable person can hear what I'm talking about and hear the echoes of new man, kind of the Soviet new man. And it is a category error, but I can see how that would be a reasonable interpretation, that I'm trying to just fundamentally reorient human nature. That's not what I'm driving through. That's not what I'm driving at with what I'm talking about here with the strict divide between between rationality and biology. New Man, if you don't recall, New Man was premised on solidarity, which is very much sociality is a necessity for solidarity. So you couldn't be further from what I'm advocating for here, right? They didn't have the correct blueprint of rationality because so much of it was surrounded class solidarity and the brotherhood. It's quite different from what I'm talking about now. I'm saying we should all strive to be asocial if that's the only path toward maximizing our rational capacities. And that button that I said I'd press, it's a hypothetical button, but hypothetically, it could not go awry the way these actual practical projects that have been undertaken in the past, they could go awry because, well, they were just projects that were thought up by fallible human brains. The button, for the sake of the thought experiment, the button you'd press, it's an infallible button, so it would actually make you more rational at the cost of making you asocial, unlike everything that was actually tried in the past, from new Soviet man to standard eugenics. It all went awry, or at least it had, from a trade-off standpoint, you just created too much collateral damage to get to your master race. But even that master race wasn't optimally rational, it was just more kind of phenotypically and genetically impressive, but not, strictly speaking, more rationally impressive. Here I'm just saying we should strive to all be more as rationally impressive as humanly possible, and even if it leads to a kind of post-human state, then we should not be wedded to our humanity as such. We should be wedded to rationality as such. And you shouldn't hear the echoes of Soviet man in that, or any other kind of radical attempt to reorient human beings from scratch, because certainly in the case of the Soviets, it was premised on solidarity, which necessitates sociality. And I'm saying sociality, if you read the literature, if you read your cognitive biases, so much of it does come down to people being dupes for group identity, and sociality is the driving force for that. Let's see, it doesn't make me an ideologue. See, this, I can also hear how that's just too idealistic what I'm trying to do. One thing that people don't get when it comes to who's an ideologue and who's not, they just look at the contents of a belief. This is also what they'll be willing to call extreme or moderate, right? The extreme to moderate spectrum is just completely, people overinvest in the Overton window. So if something is outside the Overton window, it is by definition supposed to be immoderate and extreme. But you got to think about it also in terms of just fervor. You got a lot of moderates who advocate things, but they do so on a daily basis. I'm not going to start listing examples right now. I might do some screenshots, but you just have these, whether they're on Twitter, whether they're on YouTube, whatever their platform of choice is, they're just on all the time and they're repetitive to no end. But you can say a lot of them do advocate ultimately for something that is more moderate than the kind of thing that I came out here and said we ought to do, which is maximize our rational capacities. And so does the content or the conclusion, does that exhaust whether someone is a radical as opposed to a moderate? I don't think so. It's just, you're not going to see me out on the street proselytizing this, and you're not going to see me proselytize this on the internet on a daily, weekly, or even monthly basis. I'm just going to make these arguments here, and I'll probably seldom return to it. But it is a very abnormal position, and it surely is outside the Overton window. But I'm not going to like pounce on it. I'm not going to be a nag about it day in and day out, the way so many people who are just, they've got an agenda. Yeah, it's a more moderate agenda, whether they want to revert something that was kind of the norm in the past and they want to bring it back to being a norm again, or whether they want to deviate from the norm just a little bit. There's another component to advocacy that people should recognize as a kind of predictor of being a zealot and an ideologue. And that is just the frequency with which a person feels compelled to just come back online and push for that kind of thing again and again, day in, day out. Maybe I push for a given thing on multiple times over the course of my YouTube run. Maybe I've pushed for certain things multiple times, but you'll see that I really do space it out. Months apart, often years apart, until I return back to a given thing. That's not how most people are, and that is indicative of their, at least, psychic, just their psychic propensity toward being an ideologue, is the frequency to which they feel the need to return to things. So it's not just the contents, and just how far outside the Overton window is a given thing. And there's the political Overton window, and we should also think about it from a post-political standpoint. Just the Overton window from a standpoint of just how alien does a given idea that doesn't even need to be politicized, just how alien does it strike us from a standpoint of what we're psychologically accustomed to. That's also a kind of Overton window in its own right. So another thing that I mentioned in that audio that's lost to the wind that further reinforces this point is, I was thinking of if I had to do a sci-fi or something in the realm of sci-fi that can actually show why I'm not necessarily that abnormal in terms of pushing for this, is if you had some sort of a post-apocalyptic society that the grand majority is rendered infertile. Whatever happens, don't have to get into the details of the apocalyptic event or chains of events, but whatever happens, it renders the would-be procreators, the would-be parents, the family-oriented people, it just so happens that the way the cookie crumbles, they're rendered all sterile. The few people who were child-free and kind of maybe proudly child-free, we don't have to take it beyond child-free. We can just say that they believe it is good for themselves for them not to be procreators. Don't have to get to any kind of deeper philosophical view on the procreative asymmetry on this. This is just a subjective kind of preference for the individual, right? So you have whatever the number of people. It doesn't matter what, but we could just say maybe there's a 90-10 split. 90% of the population who are would-be procreators. It just so happens that the way the cookie crumbles, they're rendered sterile. The ones who are not rendered sterile are the very people who wouldn't have used their fertility willingly, voluntarily, intentionally to begin with. And so many of the people like Toby Ord, these people who they drool for life. It's not just that he advocates for life, it's he does believe. And many of the people who praised his book, X-Risk and long-termism, like he just comes right out and says, he knows what S-risks are. Risks of astronomical suffering in the far future. He knows full well what that is. He is situated in the effective altruism community for a great number of years now. And so one of the lingering debates within EA is, within long-termist EA is S-risks versus X-risks. Risks of astronomical suffering in the far future versus risks of an extinction event that renders the planet barren for the rest of the planet's run. Just as all other planets are lifeless, when the X-risk factor eventuates, planet Earth too will be just like all those other planets. It'll be barren and lifeless. And so Toby Ord writes this book pretty much identifying the S-risk as the all-important risk to worry about. And in the process, not specifically saying it doesn't matter how many S-risks do eventuate in the process, all that matters is that we secure a future where the X-risk, the risk of an extinction event for our species or life in general, is avoided. He all but says, and he does say, this is pretty much verbatim, he says the most grievous moral mistake we can make as a society is to let humanity go extinct, right? And very few people come out and say, very few people are mortified that the S-risks are pretty much elbowed out in the name of the X-risks. And so to me, when I hear that and I come up with a kind of, like what kind of a sci-fi would I write if I had a chance to write a sci-fi? Well, I would write the sort of sci-fi where 90% of the population is rendered infertile. The 5%, let's narrow it down to as few as 5% of the population who still can't procreate. It just so happens that they're all the people who procreation was never on their life agenda. And so this 95% who might be influenced by books like Toby Ord's would turn that 5%, would coerce them through various kinds of social engineering, but we can simply take it to camps. They would just put us all in camps and they would force us to procreate. And the movie, because I wouldn't want to treat the non-procreators as necessarily more virtuous and the procreators as necessarily more vicious, the would-be procreators who are now sterile as necessarily more vicious, I would even portray the would-be procreators in a slightly more glowing light. There would be so much subtlety in this kind of sci-fi movie or maybe series that I would create. I would make the child-free crowd more snarky, more I would give them these individual characteristic defects in a way that I wouldn't give the would-be procreative majority, who is really invested in the species being perpetuated, even in this post-apocalyptic, uncertain, unpredictable environment. They would be swayed by Toby Ord's book. We might even cite Toby Ord's book in the work of fiction. I should write this out at some point, but I'm just so impatient with writing. But the point is, they would discuss this briefly without having any of the child-free people around, and they would just say, it's like, well, they don't want to do it, we've tried to persuade them to do it, we're just going to coerce them to do it because we've identified that X risks are the worst possible thing. Lifelessness is the worst possible thing that can happen. No amount of whatever is contained in a future where bad things happen and when wrong things happen and where tragic and just atrocities happen, no quantity of that can outdo, from a badness standpoint, a future where no things happen. Because let's understand, that's what it comes down to, right? My future, the way I think about good and bad things, is if a bad thing reaches a certain level of extremity and enormity, no amount of good can compensate for it. And so it's a future essentially because we know, statistically speaking, there's no generation, hell, there's no even single day, much less an entire span of a generation, where we can avoid tragedies and atrocities. Tragedies and atrocities are a daily, hourly, minutely, given how many people and species exist on this planet, they're just hourly and even minutely events. And so my ideal future, based on the fact that that's kind of locked in, it's going to keep happening, my ideal future is a future where no things happen. Their ideal future, their least preferable future, is a future where no things happen, and a future where wrong and bad things happen that should ideally be minimized, but not if it's at the cost of lifelessness. And so I think it would be really good to come up with a sci-fi style work of fiction where someone's buzzing me, where these seemingly virtuous people stoop to the level of forced birth for the minority 5% of the population that don't want to do it, and everything within the movie, because the movie would be so reverential for life, everything stylistically about the movie, I would still make it so reverential toward life, and I would have a Peterson-like figure in the movie. Goddamn, that buzzing is distracting me. I would have a Peterson-like figure within the movie, and I would have all the kind of music. I would have daunting seeming music accompany the speeches of the child-free people who say, we will not be treated like this, don't even try to persuade us. And yet I would have glowing music, and I would just have all these little indicators of the righteousness, bolster the would-be procreative crowd. But at the end of the day, like, it would be undeniable that it would partake in the ultimate form of tyranny, right? It would be an ultimate kind of tyranny to make 5% of the population forcibly procreate so that the species can continue and do so over and over again, assuming that the spawn of those people who were forced to procreate, their spawn would also be disinclined from procreating. So this can be a multi-generational thing. And yeah, I should at some point sit down and write out that type of fiction. But I also think it properly puts into context the very first few or however many minutes of the video before the audio went bad. So since my phone is buzzing and it's really distracting me. I'm just gonna pick up this at some other point, because I also wanna, there's an atrocious tweet that I just kind of want to spend like 10 or 15 minutes on. It's a guy who thinks that the culture war is actually explained by different views on biology, and he talks about how he respects it. There's two types of people in the world: people who respect their ancestors and want their descendants to exist and thrive, and there's other people who want their species to go extinct. Like, he actually thinks he can speak about the culture war as being in some way an offshoot of this natalist, anti-natalist thing, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Man, there's more and more people who are seeing anti-natalism under every rock they lift, and it's so preposterous, especially when you get into the technical know-how about the procreative asymmetry. And I want to read out the tweet and just talk about how actually that view where you have reverence for your ancestors, where you would almost in some kind of a, if you had a chance to watch the struggles of them, often their struggles having happened within the context of these lifeboat ethics, whereas their group, to survive, had to make the rival group not survive. And it's like you would almost like an athlete stand, like a spectator of pro league sports. You would get emotionally invested, just as it's really pathetic for people to this day in 2023 to not just appreciate the athleticism of the pro league teams and sports, but they get emotionally invested most of the time simply because it's the hometown versus the out town, the away group. It's no more high-minded. It's even less high-minded when they get this kind of emotional whiplash surrounding their ancestors. And it's even more pathetic because at least when it comes to the pro league teams, it's an identifiable individual, whereas all your ancestors as individuals, you don't know them from Adam. It's just a mere abstract idea of them having had their ancestors. And because there's a biological through line between the individual and them, they think that they're in some cases indebted to them. And so they would cheer for them the way a sports dupe cheers for their hometown against the away team. It's, yeah, I'm just gonna do like 15 or 20 minutes on that alone because I think it explains why there's racial tension. That's the other part I want to connect it to. The moment you realize that you should just have you shouldn't hate your ancestors, but you certainly should have no love for them. He didn't use the word love, but there's a lot of other people who use the word like love when they speak of their ancestors. And then the moment you take issue with that, they immediately revert to categorizing you as someone who hates your ancestors. It's like, I don't love or hate my ancestors. I'm just completely neutral to them. And that's the only intellectually healthy position to have. But these people are yet another group of people who are just constantly in a push-pull mode. If you don't love what they love, they cannot decode you. They cannot fathom you as anyone other than someone who hates his ancestors and someone who wants this species to go extinct for these perverse reasons. If there's ever a case where I want the species to go extinct, that is to say I even want the individual who doesn't want to die, is because that individual is a menace. I wouldn't want an individual who doesn't want to die simply because that can help the species go extinct. There's so many layers of apples and oranges to all this. But anyway, I'll because my phone keeps buzzing, it's really distracting. I'll end this now. And I'll do a proper takedown of that tweet, and I'm motivated to do it, even though it's just a stupid tweet, because it gets so many retweets and likes and positive remarks, and it's just such in-your-face irrationality. It really is. I mentioned like non-literal booger eaters in the first gender video. This is yet another thing where it's like, if we had anything remotely resembling a healthy culture, that person would be as ashamed as a kind of person who, in a gross out compilation video, who's out in public, who is caught picking his nose and eating his booger, and then kind of looking around to see if he was caught. As embarrassing as that is, that literal kind of booger eater, these psychic booger eaters who talk glowingly and proudly about how they take their cognitive marching orders from their biological pressures, it's every bit as intellectually embarrassing, and it's just embarrassing proper as the actual literal booger eater is. So we need to start using these kinds of terms. Non-literal booger eaters. He's a non-literal booger eater. Spread the word. I'm back. I mean, it's just so insulting. a part of me is just motivated to, and I wish people were as transparent as I'm going to be here, because I think this is why people are motivated to even overdo their online activities. But what really drives me is when I run into a tweet like that, it's like, it's not about me changing the world. It's about, I have these specific things I want to say to insult people like that who are just so imprecise about what I believe, and I see enough of what I believe implicated in what they say, and they engage in this associational logic, so they would even associate me with perspectives that I find odious, but because they're just so push-pull binary that it truly is insulting, and they can't be spoken to. Like, if this guy who tweeted this, listened to this video, he just wouldn't have patience for it. He would, like, whatever he would say, I just know he wouldn't have patience for it. That would be the first thing. But it's what drives me these days. I just want to be fully transparent with it. What drives me so much is because I hear how he has his clapping seals. I can almost hear the claps in the form of these retweets and likes and comments as positive receptions to the tweet, and how he conveys what he wants to convey to the people he wants to convey it to, and how they're so self-satisfied. What I want to do in turn is, beyond anything else, I have these specific people who I view as the intended recipients of my insults. I can try to be constructive and critical, first and foremost. I can do that. But I know that the icing on the cake for me, in terms of what motivates me to come on and upload, is just, I want the intended recipients of my insults to hear those insults, and to, however briefly, feel truly stupid about themselves. Because it is a tidal wave of imprecision, the way he thinks about the culture war and what's at the root of the culture war. There's just so much imprecision. He's just never sat down and read it, but he commands the attention of so many people. It's so insulting. I'm not here to try to change anything. I'm not even here, a lot of the time increasingly, I'm not even here to get to the new frontiers of philosophical inquiry. I am that way when it comes to my best behavior, but I'm not on my best behavior at all times. I know that at my pettiest, it absolutely is true, and I know that if it's true for me, it's true for everyone else in higher droves. Like, I really want these intended recipients of my insults to hear these insults and to feel really stupid about themselves. It's important to me because I know they exist. It is a kind of cosmic crime that I know this guy exists, but he doesn't know that I exist. And it's not that I feel stupid when I hear him butcher something I believe, or something that is not necessarily that I believe, but something that's implicated, however indirectly, in terms of what I believe, in what he's doing. It's not that I feel stupid because of that, but I feel robbed of my dignity because he convinces so many other people. And that superficial analysis is the path of least resistance, and that's what works. And so it doesn't get me to go so far as to feel stupid about myself, but you know, it goes back to even school. The most juvenile kid gets the class laughing at the silly jokes he makes. That's kind of what this is, and yeah, it's just more and more often I just find myself pining for a platform where they hear what I say about them. Just because I want to do the tit for tat thing. It is in some way pre-analytical. But the analytical part is the most important part. It's just I'm still an ape, right? And that also speaks to why I want to maximize my rational capacities, because I don't want to be petty in the ways that I recognize myself being. But I'm only reactively petty. I never instigate pettiness. To the extent that I am petty, it really always is because I see some other kind of shortcut that someone took, ended up being successful, and especially when it's at the expense of something that I believe directly or something that is closely approximating my belief. This is just such a glaring example. There's just Twitter, I make mistake. Anytime I even pop into Twitter, I check to see what's trending. I check the first handful of comments beneath what's trending, or checking on what's trending, and then the commentary of the trended topic. It's just so bad. It's even worse than this. But yeah, so I was going to connect it to the subject of why there is racial tension. To the untrained eye, this has nothing to do with the topic of why there's racial tension. But think about it for very few seconds and you realize that if he has a great admiration for his ancestors, and like I said before, it doesn't even have to be love, but a lot of people will use a word like love. They love their ancestors for all the sacrifices they made, right? But ancestor groups butchered the living hell out of each other. It was a game of lifeboat ethics. Very often, one group's survival necessitated the elimination of the other group. And if we could just actually sit back and watch all this, if this had actually been recorded, right? This person, there's no way he's going to deny that he wouldn't emotionally root for his specific ancestors against the ancestors of some other group. And so, on that lens, like, it's very easy for me, not taking that lens, it's very easy for me to point out why Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, you can go down the list, Ibram L. Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones, why they're completely unjustified in spouting the talking points that they spout, right? But truly, when you invest in your ancestors, on that deeper view, when you invest in your ancestors, and when you can prove conclusively that they were wrong by other types of individuals who are no longer alive, but individuals who have descendants, right, whose descendants can be easily traced to the society you exist in right now. So we can think of the peculiar institution right now, chattel slavery in America. On this guy's view, it doesn't matter that all those people I just named individually are spouting a bunch of shoddy, let's say, analytically shoddy approaches to whatever kind of policy platform they want to advance. It's so easy for me to explain why that's wrong. It's not easy for him because he de-individuates, right? Especially when you use a word like love. All these people who refuse to be parsimonious with their love, it can extend to their ancestors, it can extend to their love of country, it can extend to their love of Christ or Muhammad or the Prophet. What these people do is they refuse to be parsimonious with love. I think this is probably setting aside what's factually true, the best thing about secularism is there's nothing within secularism that tricks us into being flippant with who we extend love to. It really has to be individuated. They'll spin this, a character like Douglas Murray will spin this and say, actually, this is a weakness of secularism. It doesn't offer anything grandiose the way these other things do. But really, all I see in those grandiose stories of meaning, is people getting tricked into being non-parsimonious with their love and extending a word like, diluting a word like love to extending it to people that they've never met, non-entities even, people they can't possibly meet because they're not even people to begin with. And on that kind of rationale, why shouldn't the intergroup feuds of the past and the intergroup wrongs of the past, a la chattel slavery, why shouldn't that spill over right now? Because for me, when I think about it individually, if there's an individual I love and someone else wrongs that individual, and let's say it's not the person who wronged that individual who I have to deal with directly, but another person who there's mutual love between them, or just respect and admire. It doesn't have to be as strong as love, but love really makes the point so much more clear. Like, you wrong someone I love, you're unapologetic about it, you're damn right I'm going to take issue with you. I don't care about anything else about you. That's enough for me to take issue with you insofar as you can't see that you wronged and profoundly wronged a person I love. But if you're flippant with your uses of love, you extend it to these legal fictions like a country. There's people, you can see the glimmer in their eye. They truly do love the idea of a country, especially a country like America. And the moment you say you don't love it, again, as with ancestors, they would say, it must be you hate it. There's just such scared animals. Animals who can talk, that's all they are. But the point I'm driving toward is, yeah, absolutely. Racial conflict on their lens can never be on the ash heap of history because it's about de-individuation. When they invest that much into people who they've never met, they can't possibly know anything about them as individuals, but just because there's that biological through line, it's enough for them to be resentful. And so all this racial grievance mongering under the guise of racial healing, it's a kind of standpoint epistemology that he has no intellectual resources to take arms up against, right? The only way you can take arms up against it is just to say that to the extent that we despise or like or love individuals, it has to do with the fact that we know them in some sense, and it can't be on the basis of the groups they belong to. But ancestor, you love your ancestors precisely because it's a group that you now happen to belong to. And I just think that that's something that very few people who are really critical of things like CRT and loosely associated racial healing doctrines, they don't really catch, because I'm sure this guy is critical of CRT, but he can't see how, like, it's perfectly valid. Because you love your ancestors, then a black guy who lives in America who can trace his lineage directly to his ancestors, that intergroup conflict must carry over. If you're going to be emotionally invested in the one side on a positive way, then you can be emotionally invested on the opposite side, the side that oppressed your ancestors, and emotionally invested negatively in that different kind of way. And so racial conflict is always going to be simmering, right? Unless you just on arrival, unless you just declare that a refusal to love one's ancestors doesn't necessarily mean that you should be accused of hating them, much less of wanting your species to go extinct. Right? The extinction stuff is a cost-benefit thing. It doesn't necessarily, nothing in the culture wars touches on that. And it just never ceases to amaze me how people reach to fumble, and fumble in that specific incoherent way where it's a desperation. They advertise their desperation to mishmash a bunch of topics that are clearly disparate, and they're so behind the curveball that they can't even, they don't even realize how all they're doing is advertising their desperation. It's what I see when people just, I mean, Tucker Carlson covered David Frum a couple of nights ago, and every time Frum gets coverage by an outlet like Fox News, one of these mega outlets, these MAGAs pour in, and they always point out how he was a speechwriter for Bush during at least the early 2002 when Bush gave the famous Axis of Evil speech. And they bring that up as if to point him. It has nothing to do with the current controversy, and they think that that discredits him to this day, even though he's talking about a host of different topics. But it's like, oh, right, Axis of Evil speech, Mr. Axis of Evil is what they refer to him often. And just so many of them just pour in. Sometimes it doesn't necessitate the Fox covering someone like Frum for those types of people to pour in, but they pour in such droves. And it's not just that they just parrot that time and time again, it's that there's just such a disconnect. They can't figure out that all you're doing is when you point out something someone did that was irrational or immoral that's over 2 decades old now. This is over 2 decades old since he's contributed to a George Bush speech. And yet that's what they lob at him. It's like all you're doing is advertising your desperation, that you have nothing as of late that you can point to. Certainly none of the arguments he made in the last thread I read, but you expect them, because you see just the people pouring in and you think that they're going to say something specifically about this thread, but all they do is talk about how you got Iraqi blood on your hands from. It's like he wasn't even a policy analyst or an advisor, he was a speechwriter. So it's like just a mishmash of symbolic and actual. You can say that he is symbolically responsible, because that's what speeches are, symbolism, and getting maybe rallying the non-official troops, the voter troops, through a good presidential speech. It's meant to rally the civic agents, at least. But even then, I wouldn't assign much in the way of responsibility for that, because it's like these are the very people who are supposed to believe in personal responsibility. And each Shia who killed each Sunni, and each Sunni who killed each Shia, that's a decision they chose. You can talk about other grander forces, macro level forces, but you can't completely discount the fact that it's not all on the hands of a speechwriter who worked for the administration that overthrew the strongman that led to all these sectarian forces. I don't know why I lobbed into this, but there's just so much the more time I spend online, the more I see how desperate people are. That's why I said scared animals. And they can't even realize how desperate it is to reach for something that's over 2 decades old, here in the case of Fromm, but there's many other examples where just people can't pick up on their desperation, how they just reach to mishmash stuff that's got nothing to do with the current thing. So I'll have to do a qualifier. God, I should have done this right off the bat as soon as maybe I'll throw this in previously, but when I talked about the asymmetry, as I like to articulate it, the procreative asymmetry, I phrase it in terms of the willingness to do something and the unwillingness to do something else. And so I said the willingness to insert a person into existence who has a 9/10 chance of living the worst life of all time by all standards, and then the unwillingness to insert a person into existence who has, I said 9/10 initially, and then I changed it to a definite. So it's a sure thing that it'll be a person who's going to live the greatest life of all time. I didn't say a very important thing to kind of put the icing on the cake for that, and that thing is, it's not a relative standard. So it's not that he's just living a bad life out of the bunch, so such that he's simply better than the rest. No, when I say the greatest life of all time, I mean from an absolute standard. It's an absolute positive life, not simply better than the rest. It's a very important thing because it's important to treat the disparate cases fairly. So if we use a word like worse to denote bad, we have to use a word like best to denote not just less bad, but actual good. And still, the asymmetry packs a lot of punch. When you even grant the idea that there can be such a thing as good lives, people get this wrong. I spoke about this in the video, Existential Jaws and Procreative Asymmetries. I qualified this in that video, but it needs to be done over and over again, because people think that to believe in a procreative asymmetry, you need to believe that there's no such thing as a good life. You can absolutely grant there's such a thing as a good and even great life, and even a majestic life, and still recognize this fundamental asymmetry. The willingness to insert the bad is just worse than the unwillingness to insert the good by an absolute standard good, not just a relative less bad style good. It's just a conceptual puzzle. It doesn't make any empirical claims about whether or not lives actually can go well or even badly. Of course, we do make empirical claims that lives can go badly, but I think a lot of people are confused about anti-natalism in the sense that I guess the term global anti-natalism would speak to this and say that there's no such thing as a good life, but we can localize that and grant that there's good, great, beyond great lives of splendor, but still come back to this fundamental asymmetry about just how much worse it is to do the latter, or sorry, the former. How much worse it is to have that willingness, to have that inclination to insert the worst possible, as opposed to the disinclination to not insert the best possible life. Objectively speaking, it would be a good life and a great life. And I don't see this difference made in ordinary talks. I rarely even see it made when it comes to philosophical anti-natalist talk. The only time it gets made is in that, when I made it in that video as a prelude to the actual paper I played. But it's a crucial thing. We don't have to believe all lives, that there's an empirical truth that renders all lives insufficient to whatever the good would be. No, lives can be sufficiently good, but then there's still a lot of other things, just conceptually speaking, that we ought to take into account. The sci-fi, so I want to say a few more things about the sci-fi. The title would be Natalist Gulag. I can't recapture the dialogues, because I started from scratch to finish. I just did the whole movie in my own head. This is when I blaze, I get so creative. I swear to God, I was walking for over an hour and I just had the whole thing from start to finish, and it was so good. If I sat down to write it, it wouldn't be as good because my brain just goes much faster than my typing and writing speed. But it would be titled Natalist Gulag, and I would have, just as you see right now, this, I think it's frequent enough so I can say it's frequent, this claim of Republican in name only, rhinos. I would kind of steal from that and incorporate it into the sci-fi, into Natalist Gulags, as I would title it. And what would happen is there would be a few of these people who are in the majority, who now can't procreate, who would like to procreate, and they would be squeamish. They would be squeamish when it would be clear that people who are influenced by books like Toby Ord, that they want to do this to the minority of people who can't procreate. There would be a minority of people who, yes, life's very important to them, but because it would be so tyrannical, and so it would be such overreach. There's no, even the term overreach is milquetoast. Really, a tyrannical thing would be the best way to summarize it, but it's just the only way that they can have future generations. And then there would be a minority, let's say, of those would-be procreators who would be so squeamish that they would actually try to prevent the rest of the majority from pulling off this plan. And then they would be surmounted very quickly, and they would have separate camps for them, and they would call them natalists in name only. So it wouldn't be rhinos, as we see with the GOP things. I guess the never-Trumpers nowadays get called rhinos. In the sci-fi, it would be ninos. So I would use stuff like that that's kind of recognizable from what we see in political culture, and I would incorporate it into this distant theme of future generations in a post-apocalyptic society, and the true believers in terms of the people who recognize that extinction is the worst possible thing, and those who have second thoughts and who will be disposed of for having their second thoughts because they're not true believers. They're ninos. They're natalist in name only. I would sprinkle things like these. There's other things that I think the keen reader will appreciate. But all the while, I would still make sure to always portray the child-free crowd in a stylistically more negative light, and in a few cases, I would give them these characterological defects, so that I wouldn't be telling a black and white story. The black and whiteness of it would be only evident perhaps at the very end, after numerous generations have passed, and you just have it be predictable time and time again. The next generation just doesn't want to procreate, and they're forced to procreate. So I would show how even people who are more virtuous can be driven to commit atrocious acts, apart from the fact that their inner characterological state is superior than the, let's say, less virtuous people who are their victims. I think that would be a tasteful way of putting it. Impulse skepticism. Oh yeah, so when the wind really got bad, I really liked how I put this. But I spoke about impulse skepticism, and I started trying to explain why does it feel like there's just this infinite distance between us, those who are inclined to agree with me with everything I'm saying here, or with much of what I'm saying, between us and others? Why does it feel like such a grind getting it to seep into their minds? It doesn't seem like it's that complex. It doesn't seem like it's that it shouldn't feel like hard work. But you run up against certain people like Peterson, where it's like it just feels like such an uphill climb. And what explains that? And I think we might be assuming certain things that we all had in common coming up that we just didn't. So I just know that coming up, even before the age of reason, I did draw these distinctions between earnest preferences and intrusive preferences. The intrusive preferences went into high gear when puberty kicked in, but even pre-puberty I had these intrusive preferences, like in the form of tics and various kinds of instincts. And I think if we could actually trace everything per thought in terms of how each individual came up, I just think that these people who are so hooked by the will, whose negative reactions are just visceral negative, vituperously negative reactions, when they hear something in the form of anti-natalism and even just child-free, they just get so freaking rhetorically ugly. They get rhetorically ugly with it, the way Peterson did in the clip that opens up this video. What that is yes, they're scared animals, and they see something that scares them because deep down they believe it might be rational. But even though they might grant that it's rational, rationality doesn't rule the roost for them, and that's because where you and I probably did differentiate things like impulses, and we had a certain skepticism in terms of our impulses that still got us to act coming up, and here I'm thinking as early as I can remember. It would always feel intrusive when it was an instinct or something in that ballpark, as opposed to a long deliberative process following which you still chose to act. You choose to act in light of an instinct overwhelming you, and then you genuinely, intentionally choose to act following the process of some deliberation, a well thought out plan or something of that sort. And I just think that intrusiveness that you probably feel and I feel when it comes to the former is just something that these people who have no stomach for anti-natalism, who have zero curiosity to have this debate in a dispassionate, civil tone, what we're assuming is the reason we're so baffled at their obstinance is we fail to recognize that they probably just come in, they probably never had this sharp divide. The impulse and the deliberative process leading to two different types of acts, those two acts for them were just categorically of a piece. Whereas for us, we just drew these sharp divides. We probably didn't articulate it. I didn't articulate it, certainly as a kid. I didn't even articulate it to myself during adolescence or maybe even in early adulthood, but now it's just crystal clear. Ever since I can remember, there were things I did guided by instinct, and there were things I did guided by things more enlightened than instincts, and one just felt far more intrusive than the other. But I think for a lot of people, it's just one of the same. And that's why it's such a barrier. And we assume that the barrier is so frustrating for us because we assume our experience, something we've known ever since we can remember, we're assuming that that's how they operated as well. These people that are just so thick-headed and vituperous, I guess, when it comes to stuff like anti-natalism. They're just not embarrassed by instinct, and they don't see non-instinctual reasons to act as fundamentally more high-minded. And when they don't have that, the wall, it's a kind of permanent wall that will never penetrate. And we ought to make peace with that. But I still think, if they just heard certain types of insults, I still think for however briefly, I could make them feel stupid about themselves. And that's one of the reasons. I'm not going to say it's the primary reason I'm doing this video, but it's one of the reasons why. It's because I have certain needs, and certain of my needs are indeed hateful. I hate them because I see hatefulness in them, and I'm too much of an ape myself, and I want to retaliate. I want to treat hate with hate. It's another reason why I press the button to make myself more rational, so that I'm not taken in by that. But I'm not going to deny, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm going to be perfectly open with the fact that it doesn't take a lot for me to hate someone. Meaning and mobsters. Oh yeah, so Peterson often, when I say they rig the game, Peterson said, well, it's not about happiness, it's about meaning, right? And so even meaning has its antipode, it has its flip side, just like with happiness, it's unhappiness or sadness, right? With flourishing, it's suffering. And if there's more suffering, or however we break it down, right, in these ordinary discussions, if there's more suffering than flourishing, then that's reason to not view the absence of a future generation as some kind of forsaken gain. Even if there's more flourishing than suffering, it doesn't mean you should view future generations as the absence of future generations as these forsaken gains. But I think when he diverts from hedonic criteria or even various forms of non-hedonic criteria, and when he just fixates on meaning, well, even that is open to a certain kind of existential calculus. Because then if there's more meaninglessness than meaning, either just across people, or if there's just more individuals who live more meaningless lives than meaningful lives, even if some individuals do achieve whatever he wants to say meaning means, he probably has some cosmic sense of meaning, where meaning corresponds to some kind of cosmic force, whereas to me it's just purely terrestrial. Meaning is just intrigue. It's just something that charms you in a enlightened, high-minded way. Meaning is the opposite of instinct. But see, the reason they rig the game is because he says, well, people should pursue meaning above all other considerations. And even then, it's like we can still just empirically investigate by whatever his precise formulation of meaning is. Like, do most people actually achieve a meaningful life? Do they have more meaning or more meaninglessness? And I would argue, just like with all these other hedonic, post-hedonic standards for what makes life go well and badly, even if we apply pure meaning, have you looked at the average person? Have you looked at the average commenter, these complaints I launch into, these tirades I launch into about Twitter. I gotta stop doing that. I know you all know how much I despise how people conduct themselves on Twitter, but I just impulsively feel the need to launch into how much I hate it over and over in each additional video. The point being, nothing that I'm seeing in terms of people leads me to believe that there's a majority out there that achieves a sufficient degree of meaning such that there is more good than bad in the world. But see, the moment they pivot to something like meaning, they do it in this sly way where meaninglessness can never be something that's daunting enough such that we don't view the absence of future generations as forsaken gains. You can still always, when you go with meaning, it doesn't matter how much more meaninglessness exists over meaning, you will always end up thinking that it is a forsaken gain, the absence of future generations. It always can count as a forsaken gain. So it's not a calculus they're doing. The reason they rig the game is because by shifting to meaning, there is no calculus to be had. And just think about it from the standpoint of why meaning is not even the standard I would go by, and I think everyone recognizes it. If they're just gonna, if I'm just allowed to paint a scenario where a purely innocent person who lives the most meaningful life out of anyone else in society, we know full well that this person is purely innocent and is living a meaningful life. And then we have another person who is purely innocent, who is living a purely meaningless life. He's never had any kind of encounter with meaning. And so I'm gonna incorporate mobsters into this scenario. And these mobsters who are utterly remorseless, any consideration apart from the mob's agenda and serving the interest of the mob boss and the godfather, they're just purely self-serving from the standpoint of what's good for the mob, for the organization, the crime syndicate. They're not moral agents. They're not even minimally moral agents. They're purely amoral, and there's no amount of harm that there's going to give them any kind of pause. They're going to do whatever amount of harm it takes for them to serve their mobbish agenda. They're going to impose that harm on whoever is caught up in their crossfires, right? And so they get some bad info, and this purely innocent person who is living the most meaningful life in the society right now, we have full proof that he's got the most meaningful life. They end up getting some bad info thinking that he's got a piece of information that is just crucial for them to pull off their, achieve their, whatever the agenda of the day is. And so they capture him and they bring him down to their basement and they just start tormenting him. They're tormenting him, but he is, despite this, they're not gonna kill him. It's just that he doesn't have the information that they think he has. And they're imposing unspeakable acts on him, but they're not gonna kill him. So he will continue, whatever meaning level he's achieved, that meaning level is going to stay stable because they're not going to end his life, but they will nonetheless torment him for, I don't know, however long. They're not going to get what piece of information they think he has. They're just simply not going to get it because they're mistaken in that, but they're convinced that he has it, so they just keep tormenting him. And the bystander has the proof. They can show the mobster that they're mistaken in this, and it wouldn't be there would be no combat necessary. The kind of moral agent in this scenario, who's the bystander, who's nearby, who's caught wind that this is what they're doing, all he needs to do is show up in the basement and just utter one sentence, maybe show him a piece of paper, and that's all it's going to take to make them realize that they've got the wrong guy and they're imposing suffering pointlessly. And then they would let him go if he chooses to do that. But this victim, can we even refer to him as a victim if it's so important? This meaning to meaninglessness criteria is so exhaustive of who we treat, how we treat individuals evaluatively, how we view them evaluatively, and then even how we act around them, morally speaking. So the bystander here has a choice, right? He can move, he can inch toward this basement to prevent this, or he can inch toward the opposite side where the guy who is living comfortably, who's not in any danger, he's living very comfortably but meaninglessly. And there's a narrow window of time for our moral agent. Let's suppose that the moral agent can give this guy who's living this comfortable, meaningless life a kind of pep talk where he will set him, but it's a simple pep talk that will set him on the right course to obtain meaning in his life. It's not going to make him any less or more comfortable. He will just go from meaninglessness to meaningfulness, simply by a pep talk that this bystander moral agent can give to him if he moves, let's say, rightward. He moves leftward, he gets to the basement where the mobsters are committing unspeakable acts to an innocent to an innocent victim who they've captured. He moves rightward. He can get to the guy who's living a meaningless life just in the nick of time. Where if he doesn't get to him fast, that guy will no longer be in that spot, and he won't have this opportunity to set him onto a future that is truly meaningful, right? So we're just going to hold fixed for the person who's getting tortured. We're going to hold fixed his meaning to meaninglessness ratio, and for the guy who's not being tortured but who is living meaninglessly, we're going to hold stable his comfort to discomfort, or his whatever hedonic or post-hedonic criteria. We're going to hold that constant. I don't think Peterson, I don't think anyone else who agrees with Peterson and vacuously nods along with people like Peterson who say it's about meaning, I don't think any of them would, from a moral standpoint, say that it is morally wiser for that person to move rightward so as to secure a meaningful future for our comfy Agent B, let's say. But Agent A, it's just so obvious to me that Agent A is the agent who is actually imperiled, despite the fact that he's got all the meaning he can ever muster, and that meaning will not be diminished simply because he's being tortured now. And so anytime someone launches into this, I understand when they say it shouldn't be about happiness, we shouldn't pursue happiness. I understand that, but then they substitute happiness with meaning. I would just say don't fully substitute happiness, sadness. Have that be, to whatever extent, part of one of the intrinsic ingredients. But the thing that we should also focus on is just rationality, as I've said so many times so far in this video. But when they pivot to meaning, the flip side of that is meaninglessness. And so you got to view meaninglessness as this urgent thing to be corrected if someone truly has never experienced about a meaning in their life. And yet there's nothing in me, and there's nothing in anyone that I've talked to and anyone that I've posed this kind of scenario to, where that sense of urgency gets us to act morally in the interest of one such person. If you're living a meaningless life, it's only on you. You're not necessarily being wrong in the way you can be when you're being made to suffer, despite being an innocent person. And this is why, morally speaking, you can't substitute hedonic and post-hedonic criteria detached from considerations of meaning for considerations of meaning. It just, I've never seen a person who would actually say that, yes, there's something within them that would cause them to lunge and to run rightward because Agent B is just so much more imperiled because of his meaninglessness. You just got to sketch a scenario that is similar to this or identical to this. Feel free to steal it next time someone goes off on these lofty talks, really kind of pampered talks. This strikes me as people who never really experienced raw heart suffering, who can say that there's no upper bound limit for suffering, but meaning and meaninglessness, there certainly is, and we got to be fixated on it. But then also not asking questions about how, well, if there's more meaninglessness than meaning, then isn't life on the whole not worth the hassle? I'm saying life on the whole is not worth the hassle because there's a lot more suffering and indignity and frustrated preferences. But it applies every bit as much. If we just empirically prove that there's more meaninglessness than meaning, or there's just simply more individuals who within their own individual lives have more meaninglessness than meaning, however formulated. So what else do I need to do here? I quickly flashed a Toby Ord. I quickly flashed through a kind of Toby Ord thing, but I didn't get into it sufficiently. So what I want to do is read from a community post that I think I left over a year ago, where I get into this, does it make sense to first talk about forsaking gains in the way Toby talks about it? And I think I want to read out that post because I remember being very satisfied with it. So that's what I'm going to do to close out this video, and I think I've covered all my other bases. So I'm going to do the post right now. I found the post. It took way too much scrolling, and I can't believe I wrote it over a year ago. Putting it this late in the video makes me wonder why I spent all this time looking for it, because late in the video means even even fewer people sticking around. But anyway, now that I scrolled, I might as well put it in here. Not enough. See, if I were cheap, then I would just do some kind of a provocative short video. It was like Toby Ord destroyed, but I'm not going to do it because I'm not cheap. I'm just going to put it at the end of an already long video, because avoiding cheapness is more important than, I guess, pushing some agenda or any of the other things that I talked about as my motivations, actually getting these people to hear my insults. As much as I'd like to get them to hear my insults, it's more important to not be cheap and hokey and clickbaity and all that stuff. So, but yeah, time flies. I can't believe I wrote this over a year ago. Time flies. That's my trite remark for the video. See, I can't go a video apparently without making at least one trite remark. Ugh. Anyway, I'm not going to read the post from top down. I will read the post in its entirety, but I'm not going to read it from the top down. I'm going to read it where I start presenting this scenario, and then I'll read the top part because I'm just too frustrated up top and it takes me too long to get to the scenario that I paint. So, off I go. A decent intuition pump for pulling the rug out of S-risk prioritization. The anti-extinctionist is presented with a cosmic lever. Pulling it would extend every extant individual's life by 1 trillion years, and this comes with the assurance that everyone who opts in will be able to live out a perfectly eudaimonic life, or insert whatever other type of ideally good life you find to be more suitable from here on out, while also giving everyone who wishes to opt out the ability to do so at any time. By opt-out, I just mean they can revert back to a state where they die of natural causes, or they have access to assisted dying, or take whatever pick you would like to supplant to mean opt-out. To do so at any time. The catch, after the 1 trillion years pass, extinction of all life is guaranteed to kick in. And for no reason other than the pulling of the very special lever 1 trillion years ago. Articulate this scenario clearly enough and the anti-extinctionist drunk on X-risk mitigation will find it difficult to make use of any such lever. Nay, assuming he is principled to his aversion to lifelessness, assuming he is principled in his aversion to lifelessness, he will plausibly shun the lever without much or any hesitation. Going by those first principles, shunning it is the infinitely wiser choice. But whether it happens at T1, T2, T3, T4, or 1 trillion years from now, willfully and knowingly withholding from one's merely possible descendants the opportunity to be born is evaluatively the same. The passage of trillion years or quadrillions of years of eudaimonic life having been experienced by actual persons doesn't undo or even slightly decrease the postulated beneficence or the postulated upside value in having, quote, countless future great lives brought into existence. Those potentialities will always be within grasp. Spotting these and other temporally binding difficulties for S-risk guided perspectives doesn't require acceptance of anti-natalism, rejectionism, or any other variant of philosophical pessimism. Spotting them, and certainly internalizing them, does require a healthy philosophical atmosphere, something Ord and the Bay Area rationalists seem incapable of fostering. And now let me just scroll up to see why I'm so frustrated with this. At the top of the post I write, for all the praise I've heaped on Bay Area rationalists over the last few years, I'll take a moment now to make clear their biggest intellectual, ethical, and indeed attitudinal impropriety, Toby Ord. All three categories of failure, all rolled into one subject and how they interact with him and his ideas. Year after year, Ord is routinely invited to chat with notable podcasters, first-rate philosophers, MSM figures, and most of all, the rationalist community, and gets nothing but softballs from them. He faces no real hard-hitting pushback despite raising ever bigger fusses over S-risks. So just remember, the worst possible thing we can do, this is now departing from the post, the worst possible things we can do, according to this book he wrote called The Precipice, is allow extinction to kick in. But extinction, that worry cannot change, whether it's right now or trillions or gajillions of years from now. That upside value, when you drool for life as he does, that upside value seems every bit as worthy of clinging to. De-individuation, despite it, right? Not thinking in terms of persons, but thinking in terms of species, really collectives. It's a kind of metaphysical collectivism when you start worrying about species extinction. And it's always going to be there. It doesn't matter how much good life is experienced, is lived out from now until trillion or a gajillion years from now. Right? That fear that there will be an extinction at which point no life will crop up again, that's just going to strike the person as a truly bad thing who doesn't reflect on the fact that it's temporally nonsensical to think that there was a great loss, there was a forsaken gain right now or a trillion years from now after all these blissful lives have eventuated. What I wrote when I read out the bottom end of the post, I'm just kind of reiterating it now because it just needs reiteration because people slip on it. People don't catch it, and yet it's such a stupid thing. We're evolved to find, just at a guttural level, lifelessness tragic. We're evolved to do it. It is not a well thought out position. It would strike the person a trillion years from now. It would strike them as truly bad, even if they're assured that it truly was this many years of great lives having been lived out by the people who are, either by generations or by these individuals who are made not eternal, but whose lives are extended in these trillion year spanning ways, whose individual lives are extended in these ways. All three categories of failure all rolled into one subject and how they interact with him and his ideas. Okay, so I read this part out. Where did I stop reading? He faces no real hard-hitting pushback despite raising ever bigger fusses over S-risks. In the event that we go extinct, the greatest moral wrongdoing, according to Ord, will be our collectively having acted in ways that facilitated or contributed to humanity's extinction, and thus to eons upon eons, our descendants not getting to be actual people, having to, quote, settle for remaining merely possible people. This requires thinking about ethics with a dose of modality, and that's a can of worms. It shouldn't be controversial to incorporate modality into thinking about our ethical decisions, but I'll get into that deeper at some other point because this is already over 7 minutes. I need to just read the post and not deviate from it. So then I link to the precipice on Wiki, and then I write, this might be the toughest, most cringe-inducing read I've ever imposed on myself, which is really saying something considering I've tried to get through some real clunkers, including Alistair McIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals, which was a self-conscious effort by McIntyre to ground virtues in an account of biology. So when I found this post and when I read that, I actually brought up McIntyre's book, which is such a... I mean, the thing that I'm ranting about in this video, I offhandedly reference in that old community post without even realizing that this was there. But see, this bio stuff, this total dearth of bio-skepticism is so pervasive that I totally forgot that I threw in McIntyre's book, which is an example of it, in this post. As much of a slog as that was, Ord's Precipice managed to be worse. Not necessarily because of the conclusions it reaches and pushes, but just as a reading experience. Well, on reflection, I'm going to renege on that. It was tied. The reading experience was bad, but also it was tied because of the conclusions it reaches and pushes. I have to say, that's the only part of the post that I would say is not true right now. Maybe I thought that back then, over a year ago, but I don't think it now. Why? Because I made the mistake of reading it after reading positive reviews by figures like Tom Shivers, who, as quoted in the link, refers to The Precipice as a, quote, powerful book written with a philosopher's eye for counter-arguments so he can meet them in advance. All caps. Except no, it goddamn doesn't do any such thing, Tom. Certainly not when it comes to the most important counter-arguments. Ord scarcely shows sign of being even cognizant of the top-tier objections, which I'll just call the S-risk greater than X-risk genre of objections. Ord doesn't address these objections satisfactorily whatsoever. And I resent the hell out of any reviewer who portrays him as anything other than the dodger he is, in the best case, or as the overconfident moral theoretic ignoramus he is, in the worst case. It's bad enough that the book received rave reviews for being cautiously anticipatory in this respect. Even more aggravating was the Toby Ord podcast tour, which buttressed those flattering notions, among other unearned ones.
I still haven't forgiven Sam Harris for partaking in that, playing oblivious to the S risks are greater than S risk pushback, which he by now must know is more powerful, if not conclusively so, then at least enough to receive adequate airtime. And I say this of Harris, departing from the post now, I say this of Harris because he hosted Benatar, and he even said Benatar can get so much mileage out of just focusing on things like S risks over X risks. He didn't put it in those terms, but at one point he said, like, David, you don't even need the asymmetry, specifically how you formulate it. You don't even need the asymmetry. So Sam Harris knows how powerful these downside concerns are, and yet totally pretends like they don't exist when he hosts people like Ord and McCaskill. It is cringy, and it does make my blood boil. Even more so when I'm recording, apparently. A decent intuition pump. Okay, so that's the end of the post. So that's, I didn't think I'd get this angry, and I didn't think this would be 11 minutes. God. But also, I'm going to quickly, before I round this out, I know I had a few other things to hit within this last audio recording, but now I forget what they are. One thing that I do remember is these images that I'm going to include at the very beginning of the video while I'm walking outside and playing those audio sections. I'm going to flash on the screen right now how I title these images, because at one point in the last video, I wrote next to the image within the video, and that just takes too much time. So a lot of these are things that actually insult anti-natalism, and I think it's good to incorporate them there. And they insult and pathologize anti-natalists. And what I kind of wanted to do was just have my negs of those things. I'm debunking them in the video itself. Maybe debunking is a strong term, but I am very much speaking against what I'm flashing on the screen in the audio sections. But because I just have no patience to do any kind of typing or writing next to the images or within the images, I'm just going to flash on the screen right now how I title those images when I save them, and how I just insult them in that way. So that's just going to be flashed on the screen right now, and I think these are pretty based insults, and I don't even think you have to agree with me fully or even 50% to see that, like, these images deserve the kind of insults I give them, and those insults are shown in how I title the files that are the saved images. So enjoy that. So I did record the Toby Ord community post that I said I was going to record, the blasting him in my community post. I just listened to it. I'm halfway into that audio that I recorded. It was over 12-minute audio. I couldn't just read the post. I had to divert from it and just ran some more. But the thing is, this is something I actually did in the camcorder section too. At one point, when I meant to say X risk, I said S risk. And I do it twice in this last community post readout. I think at one point, I should have read out X. I say S instead of X. So yeah, I'm just going to have to just avoid this, because apparently I'm prone to not saying X when I should say X, and I'm prone to saying S for some reason. I may have said it more than twice in the audio that I just recorded and only listened to halfway. I think by the time I listened to it fully, there may be more than twice. But yeah, it was twice. I'll flash it on the screen. I'll flash a big X when I say S by mistake. This is just in case you guys are only, whoever's only listening and not watching and can't see me flash that. I'm really frustrated with myself for doing that 3 times, maybe more than 3 times. I don't know. I still got to listen to the second half of that audio that I just recorded. It just really pissed me off, and I'm impulsively now recording this as a preemptive.
Hi all.
Yeah, fuck you. Gloves off.